Hello, friends. Good afternoon. It is Thursday, September 3rd, and so happy to welcome you to Thursdays with Friends. This is episode 11. It's amazing. I don't I don't know what we knew what we were getting into when we started these, but so lucky to be able to do this every other week with you. Thursdays with Friends is our online conversation on current issues. And as we approach Labor Day, we remember the thousands of innocent people whose lives were lost by gun violence. Today, we'll discuss the rise of guns and the violence it has wrought. My name is Wesley Wolfberg Pinkham. I'm the Senior Visual Arts Manager here at FCNL. And our guest host for today is Amelia Kegan, who is FCNL's Legislative Director for Domestic Policy. She's substituting for Diane, who's currently on the road. Our guest for this afternoon is Gobbo. He's the lead lobbyist for FCNL's advocacy work against gun violence. So here's our Thursdays with Friends host, Amelia Kegan, and her guest, Gobbo.
Thank you, Wesley. It is wonderful to see you all here today. Thank you all for joining us with our Thursdays with Friends, whether you're on Zoom or through live streaming on Facebook or YouTube. As Wesley mentioned, Diane Randall, our regular host, is on the road. So it is really my privilege and pleasure to be the substitute host today. So as you probably know, Congress is on recess. They get back next week. And when they return, they're going to have two major items on the agenda: the latest COVID relief package, and they have to do some sort of spending measure to prevent a government shutdown at the end of the month. And then really they're in recess until, and really the focus is then the election. So, and then Congress will reconvene, they'll have their lame duck session, and then we're gonna head into the new 117th Congress, which will take off in January of 2021. So one of the things that we're really doing, spending this time right now, in addition to lobbying hard on the COVID package and a few other things, is starting to really lay the groundwork for 2021. You know, and one of the key issues in which we've really been focusing on and thinking about how we really elevate is the issue of gun violence. As Quakers and people of faith, we're really called to reduce gun violence in our policies. And one of those is by regulating gun ownership, by regulating possession, by the use of implementation of universal background checks, bans on military style weapons, public health-oriented research and education. And we know that gun violence remains a persistent persistent throughout our society, regardless of whether it is on the front page of the news or not. And we have seen gun sales increased from March to May 2020, an 80% increase compared to the same period as last year. So I am very, very honored to be introducing FCNL's own kind of lead lobbyist for our gun violence prevention program, Gobbo. He studied at Bates College in Maine and at Syracuse University in New York, where he graduated with a master's in public administration. Andre is also the co-chair of the Face United to Prevent Gun Violence Coalition. So Andre, welcome. And so first, why don't you share a little bit about, we're seeing a lot about gun violence in the news, but really the focus has been COVID-19. And I wonder if you could kind of start us off by talking about how gun violence intersects with the COVID-19 pandemic.
Andre, I don't think we're hearing you. If you want to make sure that your microphone, the right microphone is selected.
Sorry, is this better? Can people hear me now? Okay, great. Classic problem of our times. Even though we're here all online, just new sets of problems to come across. So I apologize about that, but I'm glad everybody can hear me now. I also want to say thanks to Amelia for hosting this conversation, and thanks to everybody for joining us here today. If it wasn't for the work and help of donors and advocates like all of you that are here, we wouldn't be having this conversation. So I'll start by echoing something that Amelia said earlier, which is that, even though gun violence isn't always in the news, it's still prevalent throughout our society, and it has gotten significantly worse since the onset of the pandemic in late March. And to answer Amelia's question, there's several reasons why this phenomenon of gun violence has gotten worse and how it intersects with the coronavirus. One of the reasons why we've seen an increase in gun violence is because there's been a lot of increased feelings of isolation due to stay-at-home orders, which has led to more people committing suicide. There's been an increase in rates of domestic violence due to people that have been forced to stay in unsafe households. We've seen increased rates of depression among people who've lost their jobs or because of the economic downturn that's been caused by the coronavirus. We've seen several instances where criminals know where their targets are because of stay-at-home orders or because people have been spending more time at home. And we've also seen a spike in gun purchases that has been caused by people panic buying guns, not only in the aftermath of the initial outbreak of the pandemic, but also again after the social unrest that was sparked by the murder of George Floyd. So not only do you have all of these reasons why we've seen this increase, but there have been other additional factors that we haven't been able to parse out yet. Sometimes there are things that, we're still waiting for the data to come in and we haven't quite figured out why we've seen it. But what all of these factors add up to is the unfortunate reality that gun violence hasn't decreased or abated at all since the pandemic started in late March. And if anything, we've actually seen it increase.
Thanks, Andre. Those are some sobering kind of numbers and sobering facts. And so often when it comes to gun violence, we really do, it's easy to get lost in the numbers and sort of forget about the human impact. Could you share maybe some stories or examples that really sort of humanize what we've been seeing across the country?
Yeah, definitely. There's been several heartbreaking examples that we've seen. In New York City, there was a case of an EMT, a first responder named John Mondello, who committed suicide after less than 3 months on the job during the peak of the coronavirus outbreak in New York City in late April. And he did so by using his parents' firearms. So that's just one example of how depression becomes exponentially deadlier whenever a gun is present. In Washington, D.C., where FCNL's offices are located, there was a tragic case of an 11-year-old boy named Devon McNeil, who was killed by a stray bullet on his way home after attending a cookout that was hosted by somebody who specifically worked as a violence interrupter to try and reduce the gun violence in communities. And that instance is just an example of how communities of color bear a disproportionate burden of gun violence. In Albuquerque, New Mexico, there was a man who bought a gun due to the pandemic, who then unintentionally shot and killed his 13-year-old cousin named Patricio Arroyo because he didn't think the gun was loaded. And that's an example of how unintentional shootings have also increased because more kids are staying at home from school and because there was this surge in gun purchases and more guns in the home because of panic buying. And then during the protests and the aftermath of the police shooting of Jacob Blake, we saw a white teenager cross state lines and kill 2 people and injure a third with a semi-automatic rifle. And that's an example of how we're seeing this increasing problem of armed individuals and so-called militias at these protests that are not only increasing tensions, but also increasing the possibility of further violence. So what all of these examples do is that they just paint a more human picture of gun violence. And just because you don't see gun violence make these splashy headlines across the newspapers, gun violence is much more widespread, it's much more subtle, and it's much more pernicious, as you can see in some of these examples.
Wow, thank you, Andre. Those are some really heart-wrenching stories. I wonder if we can dig into sort of that last example a little bit more. There's been in the news a lot of attention paid to the situation in Kenosha, not only Jacob Blake's killing by it being shot in the back by police officers, but as you mentioned, the white 17-year-old who fired a semi-automatic rifle that killed 2 people and injured a third. How do these separate instances of gun violence intersect with each other? And can you place this into the larger context of racial justice?
Yeah, definitely. There's a lot going on there in that example in the situation in Kenosha, and I'll start by saying that the current administration has been consistently demonizing people who are out in the streets and protesting for racial justice, and as a result of this demonization, it's emboldened people to openly carry assault weapons and semi-automatic rifles as a means of intimidating these protesters and other citizens that happen to be in the area. However, it's worth mentioning that there have been several instances of this phenomenon that have happened prior to what we saw in Kenosha. Earlier in the year, we saw people openly carrying firearms and assault weapons during the initial protests of stay-at-home orders back in April. We've seen several tense standoffs around protests around Confederate monuments and occasional clashes. And there have been other instances of violence and shootings during these protests for social justice that have cropped up around the country. So I'll follow that up by saying that white supremacy is deeply, deeply rooted within our nation, and it's intersected with gun violence in more than one way. Just 5 years ago, we saw the mass shooting at the Mother Emanuel AME Church in Charleston, South Carolina, which was explicitly motivated by racism and white supremacy. Black and brown people are disproportionately killed by police officers. We've seen several high-profile cases of that happening, not only this year, but also several years prior to this, more names than I can list. The ACLU recently released a report finding that despite fewer people are leaving their homes and police officers are taking deliberate steps to reduce contact with people because of the pandemic, police shootings have still remained constant despite these factors. And all of this is just highlighting the fact that police violence is gun violence. 95% of all deaths at the hands of police officers are caused by a firearm. And every year, police shoot and kill more than 1,000 people. So if we don't work to continue to dismantle racism, both the overt forms of racism and the more subtle and systemic forms of racism that we see in our society, then we'll continue to see instances like what's happening in Kenosha, both the initial instance of police violence as well as the deadly aftermath that's come in its wake.
Thanks, Andre. Of course, we are FCNL, so we focus on federal policy. Can you talk a bit about what policies are out there that, bills that Congress can pass to address some of this?
Yeah, definitely. Fortunately, there's a handful of bills that are out there that Congress is working on. One of them is universal background checks, which is arguably the most popular. And that's a policy that's designed to prevent guns from getting into the hands of people who shouldn't get them in the first place. Under current law, if you buy a gun over the internet or at a gun show, then you don't have to get a background check. And it's estimated that over 20% of all gun purchases are done over the internet or at gun shows. So universal background checks would close those loopholes and essentially require you to get a background check whenever you buy a gun. There's another policy that could also have a really large impact, especially in the time of coronavirus, which are extreme risk protection orders, or ERPOs for short. And the way that extreme risk protection orders work is that if you're considered to be a threat to yourself or to somebody else and you own a gun, then family members or law enforcement or medical professionals can file a petition to temporarily remove that firearm for a period of time until you're no longer in danger of committing any harm. So this policy is designed to mostly help prevent suicides because, like I mentioned earlier, suicides are exponentially more deadly when you have a firearm present. However, ERPOs can also help prevent other forms of violence like domestic abuse and even mass shootings. We've already seen 19 different states and the District of Columbia pass these extreme risk protection orders. And we've already seen an increase in the amount of times that ERPOs have been used since the start of the pandemic. So given the current time that we're living in, this policy, these extreme risk protection orders, have the potential to play a really large role in reducing some of the more subtle forms of gun violence that we don't always see or think about.
Great, thanks, Andre. And I want to I know most of you are doing a great job of putting your questions in the chat, but certainly if you have questions for Andre, please put them in the chat. You've mentioned some of these bills, some of these legislation, and I know that I think Wesley has some graphics on the ERPO and some other resources. So here's you can see a graphic and link to go and take action on ERPOs. Andre, can you talk a little bit about kind of what's the state of play in Congress? What has Congress done so far about this?
Yeah, definitely. So the most recent action that Congress has taken is that they've passed two bills. One of them is H.R. 8, which is the universal background checks that I mentioned earlier. And then another one is H.R. 1112, which is another bill that helps strengthen our current background check system. And both of those bills passed the House in February of 2019, of last year. Unfortunately, both of those bills have stalled in the Senate, and we haven't seen much action since then. So it might not seem like Congress has done a lot on this issue, and that's partly true. But it's worth looking at the issue of gun violence within a much broader context. Those two bills that I mentioned earlier, H.R. 8 and H.R. 1112, that's the first time in over 2 decades that Congress has not only held hearings, but also eventually passed a bill on the issue of gun violence in the first place from either chamber of Congress. But more importantly, this issue of gun violence is no longer considered to be a third rail in elections or politics as a whole. So we've seen a lot of issue both in Congress and outside of Congress. And the reason why Congress has passed these bills in the first place is because of a groundswell of advocacy by people across the entire country explicitly telling Congress that they need to act on gun violence. So I absolutely cannot emphasize this enough, which is that your voice matters when it comes to this issue. If we don't continue to advocate on this, and if we don't continue to raise our voice, and we don't continue to make sure that Congress hears from us, then all of the progress that we've made so far will stall. So we need gun violence to be an election issue, and we have to create a mandate for action. So that way when a new Congress is sworn in early January after the upcoming elections, gun violence is one of those issues that they feel they have to address and they have to do something about when they come into session in January. So we've seen some success on this so far, but we really have to keep pushing and we have to keep up the momentum.
Thanks, Andre. That is very motivating and encouraging words from you. And I see that Stephen has put in that same link of how you can contact your members of Congress on ERPO, Extreme Risk Protection Order legislation. And I've got one more question for you, Andre, and then we'll turn it to some of the questions that we've been getting in the chat. And that is, you talked about raising this as an election issue. Give us some resources. How can people do that?
Yeah, definitely. I know some resources will eventually make their way into the chat, but one thing I really want to drive home, I know I sort of touched on this earlier, is that it's incredible that gun violence is even considered to be an election issue in the first place. 2018 is the first election cycle that I remember where gun violence became an issue that candidates openly campaigned on. It's the first time that I've seen people running for Congress who are touting their record on this issue and bragging about getting an F rating from the NRA. I think it's absolutely incredible that that's even happening in the first place. And also, like I mentioned earlier, the only reason why this is happening is because of our continued advocacy. So, some great ways that we can help make gun violence an election issue is by getting involved and making our voices heard. So one way that you can do that is by asking questions for candidates. A lot of candidates are doing virtual town halls or teletown halls. So one way to get involved is to attend one of those and ask your member of Congress where they stand on this issue. Will they take action? Do they support the bills that we're lobbying for? Another great way that you can get involved is by registering yourself to vote, getting your friends and family to register to vote, and creating a plan for when and how exactly you're going to vote, and then spreading that word to everybody else. I know we also have several other resources or ways that you can get involved on our website, and I'm sure those will get shared in the chat. So the last thing that I want to say on this is that I'm sure some of you have heard this over and over and over again, but our elections have consequences. And if we elect politicians who are in favor of policies like universal background checks and extreme risk protection orders and assault weapons bans, then they will get to work on enacting those policies and turning them into law. So if we want to see progress on this issue, we got to get out there, we got to vote, we got to get our friends to vote, and we have to get involved as much as we possibly can.
Thank you, Andre. And I see a lot of resources have been posted in the chat, and Wesley has shown us some of the FCNL web pages that provide some of these resources as well. So I want to go to some of the questions that we've gotten. The first is from Ben Bloom. What do you think about the Southern District of New York going after the NRA?
Yeah, I think it's fantastic to see that happen. I mean, since you're obviously aware, the NRA has been an incredibly corrupt organization with all sorts of self-dealing and disingenuousness and on and on and on. I won't rehash all of that, but I think what's important to know about the NRA is that it's great, and nobody wants to see them absolutely implode more than I do. However, the thing with the NRA is that they represent a constituency, and it's if or when, praise be, that they do go away, there will be other interests that will fill the void and will try to raise those issues and advocate for gun rights and the Second Amendment. But what's really important is that if we want to push back on that, we have to keep electing and supporting people who are fighting back against that, and we have to get involved, and we have to support policies that push against exactly what it is that they're advocating for. So it's really great to see that case happen. I really hope that the case in New York City and District of Columbia eventually do dissolve the organization. But we have to remain vigilant, we have to remain involved, and we have to keep advocating for this, even if the NRA is no longer within a few years' time.
Here's another question from Mildred. I live in an area where gun ownership is a very important part of political platform of almost all of our politicians in the area. Do you have ideas or suggestions on how to work on that topic in a way that could be productive and prevent antagonism?
Yeah, that is a great question. I gotta say, I grew up in rural New Hampshire, and that's where I'm staying with my family right now. And it's a similar spot where people really like their guns. And so one of the ways that I've found is a really useful way to sort of try and break through some of the hyperpartisanship about this is to find areas where gun owners also have concerns. And one way that I've been successful in that in the past is, talking about safety. A lot of reasons why people own guns in the first place is because they want to keep themselves and their families safe. And one way that you can make some inroads there is by talking about safety. If somebody owns a gun, it's useful to talk about safe storage mechanisms because, like I mentioned earlier, we've seen unintentional shootings on the rise. So if you talk about things like keeping your guns safe and locked, that's something that a lot of gun owners can get on board with. It seems like a pretty safe, sensible thing to do. Another way that you might be able to make some inroads is talking about how people are able to get their hands on guns even though they shouldn't get them in the first place. I've had several conversations with quite conservative Republican offices, and even some of the things they've said is like, yeah, we want to find a way where we don't have to let people get guns who aren't allowed to have them in the first place. So that's another way where you might be able to make some more inroads by talking to them about making sure, understanding that they are a safe and sensible gun owner and finding areas where you can come to some agreement, and it's out there. So hopefully those two examples that I've mentioned might be a way for you to create some positive connections with them and avoid any antagonism.
Thanks, Andre. We have another question here from Kimberly. Says, in Connecticut, we have a gun violence interruption program called Project Longevity. This has been shown to reduce gun violence here in New Haven. What are the possibilities of funding more of these programs across the country?
Yeah, that's a good question. You know, not only are there programs in New Haven, but we've also seen some success with similar programs in other cities. I know there are programs in Boston that have done well. There are programs in Oakland that they've seen a lot of success, and Chicago as well. And I think when it comes to possibilities of funding, one way that I've seen this conversation take place in Congress is through the appropriations process. I know Senator Booker has a bill has a bill that would specifically redirect funds for violence intervention programs that he wants to bundle into the broader appropriations process. So that's one way that you know, we've seen some progress around this at the federal level, is just sort of looking at it through the appropriations lens and through the federal budget lens. Because if we're spending money on things that are worthwhile, like the CDC and NIH researching gun violence, then we might as well put a little bit of money to develop some other programs, or maybe do some pilot programs to see what works and what doesn't work in different cities across the country. So that's sort of one way that I've been looking at that, that specific way of funding and supporting violence intervention programs.
I see here in the chat, we also have a recommendation for Senator Chris Murphy's new book again about gun violence. So wanted to lift that up. We also have another question here, and interested to get your take on this, Andre. Are our First Amendment rights and Second Amendment rights interlinked? Is carrying a weapon in public inherently part of our right to free expression?
Wow, that is a really good question. I think on a personal note, I think there might be something to that. But one thing that I will caution when linking the First and Second Amendment rights and, you know, carrying guns as a means to self-identify or express yourself is that oftentimes in situations like for example with the El Paso shooting that happened last year, it was completely legal for the person who committed that mass shooting to carry an assault weapon into a Walmart, walk around the store like that, totally legal until he started pulling the trigger. And that's one of those things where, yeah, he did have a right to do that until he started shooting. But if you are carrying a gun in places like crowded stores or around schools, it's going to make a lot of people feel nervous, and it's going to make a lot of people feel uneasy. So I do have some hesitations about automatically making the connection between those two. And it's something that we do have to be careful of, you know, and also in the situation in Kenosha, where you have large groups of people that are all standing together with assault weapons. Technically legal for them to do that, but it creates an unnecessary amount of tension amongst everybody that's there, considering the context that they're in, the numbers that they're in, the type of weapon that they have, and those sorts of things. So I think it's a really nuanced answer to that question. So I apologize that I can't, you know, try and get at that a little bit more, but it's something that we do need to be aware of, and we need to think about, especially when we're having this conversation.
Great. Well, we've got a ton of questions, really good questions in the chat. We only have a couple minutes, so maybe Andre, I'll just rattle them off and you can maybe answer one or two of them, or if you feel like you are able to answer all four of them in 90 seconds, you can do that. But so question one, which states are most safe regarding gun casualties? Do we know why? Can their policies be replicated? Can we make a distinction between weapons and guns? Is this difference discussed or meaningful on the Hill? Are there parallels we can draw between gun violence prevention programs and FCNL's peacebuilding work to help members see a bigger picture and link between domestic and foreign policy issues? Okay, and right. Yeah, so pick maybe one of those, or yeah, in a quick maybe 60-second answer. See what you can.
All right, I'll just do a quick lightning round. So for the first question, states that are most safe regarding gun casualties, Connecticut and Massachusetts are really great examples. And I think in those states, not only do they have things like universal background checks and extremist protection orders that we're lobbying for, they've also gone above and beyond in developing new and intuitive ways to try and curb this problem. Things like gun licensing. So the idea that, you know, similar how if you want to drive a car, you have to have a license. If you want to buy a gun, you have to have a license. Things like that. So they're taking it above and beyond and doing things like that and safe storage, all that good stuff. So those policies can be replicated, but it's much more of an uphill battle. The distinction between weapons and guns, you can make that distinction, but the thing is once you start trying to make the distinction between what's a weapon and what's a gun, what is an assault weapon, what isn't an assault weapon, then it sort of opens up this whole can of worms that members of Congress tend to get lost in trying to find the nitty gritty between like the difference between those two, as opposed to talking about the broader issue about why we shouldn't be allowing semi-automatic rifles with X number of trinkets on them in the first place, because they're deadly and they've been shown to be used disproportionately in mass shootings. As for the parallels between gun violence prevention and other peace building work, there definitely is some intersection. I know Amnesty International, they've been making a huge push on gun violence prevention in the first place, simply because of that exact same idea, where if we want to create a more peaceful society, we have to reduce gun violence, particularly here in the United States. So there definitely is some overlap there. And one thing that I would like to do is try to use some more of that language so we can make it a little bit more interchangeable going forward.
Andre, that was well done in answering some very, very good questions in a very short period of time. We are at time, so I want to just thank you all for joining us this afternoon, and really appreciate Andre for all of your insights and sharing your expertise. Join us for our next Thursdays with Friends on September 17th. Diane Randall will be back, and we'll be talking about the United Nations International Day of Peace, global peace efforts, and landmines. So I just want to again thank you all for your support and all that you give to this work and to FCNL. It makes such a difference. And it's just been a real pleasure seeing all your faces and spending this half hour with you. So have a wonderful rest of your day, and we look forward to seeing you next time.
Thanks for joining, everyone.